So as you can see from our slide, we're going to be talking about integrating peer-based academic support services within a library, and specifically we're going to be talking about how we align values and value as well. So we wanted to start off today, though, by getting a sense of kind of who's in the quote-unquote audience and to find out who's with us. So I'd be interested, for those of you who haven't typed your location in your name tag, if you could just type in where you're from, what country you're from, really quick. Okay, we've got England. And I know that there's some folks that have the UK also in their name tag. I can see somebody's from New Zealand. Got a number of Canadians. Okay. Okay. So we'd also just like to have a sense of what people's experiences might be with peer-based academic supports. So up at the top in the menu above the slide, you'll see there's a little person with their hand raised. And what you can do there is you can pull up the drop-down menu and you can raise your hand, right? So it sort of flags you. So everybody raise your hand if you currently run a peer-based program. Okay. Okay, so there's a number of people in the audience who do currently work with peer-based programs, so that's great. And now the other thing that we were wondering about, is there anybody else out there who is working in a library setting as we are, which is a bit unusual for academic support services? Okay, so we've got a number of people. And it looks like from a number of countries that are functioning in that sort of environment. We've got New Zealand, we've got Canada, we've got the UK. So we've got a pretty broad base in our audience. So we hope that what we have to say is going to be helpful to you. And of course, we'll be coming from our context within a Canadian higher education, as well as the broader North American landscape. So really the impetus for this presentation came from a book chapter that Joanna and I recently submitted that was about this very topic. And it's going to be part of a publication that's intended for library and librarian audiences related to how students can be more intentionally involved in the library. And so for us, we've been part of our library for quite some time, and so have had a chance to really experience and reflect on what that's been like for those of us, who traditionally come out of a student services or student affairs perspective, to be in a library environment now. So again, we've done a bunch of reflecting and some research on this, and so we're going to get into now what we'll talk about in this session today. So we're going to give you just a really brief history and context of our institution and the environment in which we work. Then we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what are some of the values for us as supervisors and managers of peer educator programs here at the University of Guelph, and give some examples of sort of how we see those values playing out. And then we're going to move on and talk about how those values that we've identified for ourselves as being really important, how do those align with broader values of our library or of our institution? And also, how do those values perhaps intersect and not always see eye to eye with some of the organizational values that we've encountered as well. We'll move on and then talk a little bit about the concept of value and how we demonstrate value in our work. And then we want to wrap up with some implications and hopefully some quote-unquote discussion related to the influence of these things related to values and value on our profession. So we did think about sort of what would the intended outcomes be for this session. So what we hope is that you'll be able to learn more about our peer educator programs. We hope we can learn a little bit about yours as well. that you'll be able to have a chance to reflect and think a little bit about your own values as a learning support professional, that you'll be able to reflect and identify some of the values that are present in your broader context, as well as to consider the way in which, as a profession, how do learning support folks demonstrate their value on their campus? How do we show people that we're having impact?
Okay. So we're switching over to Joanna here. That was Krista. And we wanted to give you a little bit of context about where we are, because we're very much coming from our own personal observations of value and values in our library. So just in brief, we are both supervisors of peer educator programs within the University of Guelph. It is in Ontario in Canada. It's a comprehensive university of 22,000 students, many more undergraduate students than graduate students. And we're known for our vet school. It is the oldest one in the Commonwealth outside of the United Kingdom, I heard. As you can tell from the picture of the students with the dog. We also have a very strong history of student volunteerism and student activism. So if you look at the picture in the lower left-hand corner, that was from a few years ago when hundreds of students came together for a volunteer opportunity of packaging up food, and it was led by a student who kind of orchestrated and organized the whole thing, and he managed to get, I don't know how many people involved, students, staff, faculty, in this volunteer endeavor. And something like, I think, well over 60% of students, and there was a survey recently, said that they volunteer either on or off campus. And we're mentioning that because that's, we think, quite important to understanding the context of the values inherent within our peer educator program. Okay. So we also wanted to talk about the history of our learning commons, which is where we're situated. And I've already seen a little bit of conversation in the chat about this idea of what does it mean to be in a library? Are you physically in it? Are you part of it? And that's exactly the type of thing that we are hoping to delve into over the next 45 minutes or so. So Marianne is typing in actually some of our information here. So Marianne works with us and is also from the University of Guelph. So if you look at the slide, we just have a little chronology here. We began as learning and writing services, maybe even a name before that, in roughly the mid-1980s. And we were housed in student affairs. And we were located in a building on the 3rd floor, which also housed a lot of student affairs types of programs. So counseling services, services for students with disabilities, etc. We outgrew the space, and in 1999, we physically moved from that building to the 1st floor of the library. And to move from the 3rd floor of a building to the 1st floor was great in terms of visibility, and it certainly started to shift everyone's sort of perceptions and ideas about what does it mean to do academic support. Also in 1999, that's when we started calling ourselves the Learning Commons. And it was the idea that we were bringing together multiple ways of learning within one umbrella. So it was a collaborative program. Now, today we're focusing on peer educators, and we've had peer educators since the mid to late 1980s within our Learning Commons. Right now, we have roughly 100 peer educators in about five or six, anyway, we keep losing track, 5 or 6 different sort of areas helping to run different programs. And we also wanted to point out, too, that if you go back to our timeline, so we've got all these peer educators. We've got the staff who supervise peer educators. And in 2007, while still based in the library, that's when we moved administratively from student affairs into the library. So we had about an 8-year period where we were in one building but reported to administrators in another building. And then in 2007, I would say that we became fully integrated into the library, started reporting to various people within the library. Our budget is part of the library's budget. So that's where we are right now. And then I think just to give you a little bit about what our peer educators do, Krista runs essentially our supplemental instruction program with about 40 leaders there. We have learning peer helpers and writing peer helpers who provide both one-on-one support and offer workshops for students in both academic writing skills and in academic skills related to time management and study strategies. We have a particular cohort of students who work with athletes, student athletes working with other student athletes. I think the other thing that we wanted to mention here to understand sort of where we are, we report to the library, and we're now in a unit where we've got 100 peer educators. We've got about 12 staff who work very closely with those peer educators. We also, though, are within a unit that includes the information literacy team, which is made up of about 5 librarians, and they do not have peer educators. So we've been working closely with that team because we're all in that same unit together, but yet we come from very different backgrounds, and I think that has really helped shape some of our thoughts and ideas about values and value.
Okay, so we're switching it up now, and here this is Krista again, and we're going to be looking now a little more in depth into this idea of what are our values as practitioners and as professionals. So I'm just hoping to get sort of some quick responses into the chat here. Take a moment to consider the work that you do, and what would you say are the values that underlie your approach to your work? Whether it's, inclusivity, respect, whatever it might be. We're just looking for sort of off-the-cuff answers and what immediately comes to mind. So I'm just going to give you a second there and have you weigh in the chat function. Okay, emancipatory practice with students. Excellent. You can see more coming. Inclusiveness, collaboration, reciprocity, equity, absolutely. You can see more people typing. Meeting students' needs, yep, being relevant, enabling and empowering folks, for sure. Yep, being student-focused, absolutely. At Guelph, we often use the term learner-centered as being sort of a hallmark of what we do. And definitely there's going to be a number of values that I think all of us as professionals will share amongst ourselves. When Joanna and I were writing the chapter that we recently submitted, the manuscript, we had gone to a couple of locations where we were sort of trying to look at, well, what are those broader values or principles that might be shared across our types of professions. And we came across 2 documents that were really informative. One of them is the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education. It's a statement of shared ethical principles. And so that one was really, really interesting in terms of the amount of contact that we have with students. Ethics becomes a very, very important topic for us to be aware of and to stay abreast of. The other document was the professional competency areas for student affairs educators. This comes out of I believe it's an American organization of the student affairs administrators in higher education. This is on their website. And so this goes through a number of skill areas and behavioral competencies that are important to consider for people in doing work that we do. Now for us though, we absolutely are trying to think of, other than those kind of broad pieces that inform our work, for us specifically here at Guelph, here in the Learning Commons, and I guess specifically for Joanna and I, what comes to mind for us. And so for the purposes of the book chapter that we did, we chose 5 particular values that we wanted to talk just a little bit more about. So the first one is a focus on self-growth and development. In terms of that being a value of ours that we are willing to put time and effort into. So in terms of our peer educators, that definitely shows up in terms of the framework that they function under, which is experiential learning. So there's a number of reflective and self-growth activities that they need to engage with in order to go through their peer educator placement with us. And then certainly for us, the reflective practice piece is absolutely key. It informs a great deal of what we do, and we see this as really part of our daily work and in how we gather feedback from our peer educators about how we're doing and what they would like to see and what feedback they might have for us as supervisors. So that, again, that self-growth and development piece is really key for us here. Like many people have mentioned, we talked about inclusivity as well. So we are definitely informed by concepts of critical pedagogy, and we intentionally try to train and have open discussions with our peer educators about issues related to power, privilege, diversity, social location, all of those things, because of the high level of contact that they do have with students. We feel like it's just, sort of being responsible educators to make sure that we're keeping them up to date and thinking and growing in those areas. The next value is community. So what we've found is that intentionally fostering a sense of community amongst our within and amongst our programs and with our peer educators really helps to give them and us a sense of belonging, a level of meaningfulness to our work. And personally, what I've noticed is that it really seems to grease the wheels for really high quality and effective service delivery. So that, if our peer educators feel as though they are part of a community and part of something larger that they are providing to the campus community, then they feel that much more engaged and they're really motivated to do their work well. So some of the examples of how we try to foster community here, a couple of them relate to some workroom spaces that we have here for our peers. So this is a place where they can go and they have access to computers and resources and textbooks and all different kinds of things that we can throw at them for their work. And they can also then meet there to meet with each other and to debrief how their programming went and to brainstorm ideas for how they might approach certain things. And we've really heard from our peers that space becomes key for them in feeling a sense of community and connecting with their fellow peers, connecting with us. So we would really highlight that. And we also do a fair bit of not only regular meetings, which everyone loves, but also deliberate team building activities. We don't just do it at the beginning of a year, we do it throughout so that people are feeling connected. The next one is a commitment to service. So certainly both us as supervisors and with our peer educators, we have sort of a common desire to help others succeed. It's a large reason why many of us are involved in the work that we do, and especially for us, because our peer educators are volunteers, the majority of them, they tend to have a desire to give back. And so that becomes a deeply held value for us. And then the last piece that I'll mention is talking a little bit about this idea of a non-hierarchical approach to service delivery. So this is for us both in service delivery and in how we operate within our programs, is that we really view our peer educators as our partners. And in that way, we try to sort of involve them in our professional community. And really along with the ideas of a community of practice, we want them to be involved and contributing to our hiring and recruitment efforts, our evaluation and assessment, our program delivery and development, as well as our marketing. We feel that they bring a really valuable perspective to the work that we do and help add something extra that we might not necessarily see or have as professionals. And even though there's lots of folks that would say, well, how can they do some of these things? And really what it means is that it's then incumbent upon us to take on the responsibility of properly mentoring them so that they are capable of making those contributions. And certainly here at Guelph, we're really lucky. We've got strong support within the campus community to have that sort of intensive supervision, that it's valued, that we're given time to do it, so that we can help to mentor these students and help them grow and develop. So just to give you a sense of how that aligns, say, with our larger organizational context values. So again, we're now part of our library administratively. And a number of years ago, we went through an organizational review process that sort of went through exercises where we came up with sort of a new vision, a new set of values. So you can see them there on the screen. And certainly there's many that that would absolutely overlap with a lot of the values that you've mentioned in the chat function and what we just talked about in the last slide. So focus on learning, service, communication, and integrity. I mean, these are all things I think that are commonly held, certainly amongst all of us. But you'll also notice values like stewardship and intellectual freedom, which are definitely, in our experience, more library-centric terms. And so while there are certainly some ways in which our values align very well with our broader library values, you can see that there are also some areas in which there's not complete agreement.
Okay. So we're going to move on to intersections. I thought that I would address Suzanne from New Zealand's question about our volunteers. They do get recognition, but not monetary recognition. Suzanne. So she had asked about our peer educators because they are volunteers. They get a notation on their transcript for their participation as a peer educator. And they're asked to volunteer either 5 or 10 hours per week for a minimum of 3 semesters. And this sort of links back up to the University of Guelph's very high rate of student involvement and activism, that students really want to be in these peer educator positions. We get more applications than we have positions for, so it's quite a competitive process. So certainly if there are more questions about that later, we'd be happy to address them. But right now I wanted to go to talking about values. And so Krista was talking about some of the values we've identified in our peer educator programs, and some of the values that were identified in our library. But we also wanted to address 3 areas where we see intersections. And I think we chatted originally as we were writing this chapter, do we call it intersections? Do we call it challenges? Do we call it tensions? And we really focused on the word intersections because tension seems very negative, and this isn't negative. It's a way of how do we define what our values are and how do we express them? And what do we do when we have different types of values and they intersect? And so we're going to talk about 3 areas that we have really noticed. So the first one is the whole idea of inclusivity. And as peer educators, supervisors, we really value this notion of inclusivity. We want all of our programs to be inclusive of students. And in terms of the library, if I'm speaking about it as an external being, not me in the library, but the library sort of system, they also want inclusivity. But what we noticed was that there are different interpretations of what inclusivity means. So when we are working with librarians or reading documents sort of written in the library field about inclusivity, it really comes up as this notion of individual access and also intellectual freedom. So it's all about inclusivity, is all about access to services, access to collections. It's about giving people sort of the opportunity to read whatever they want to read and to form their opinions on that. And we see that as a very individual, very focused on the individual approach to relating with the library as a whole. What we have found in our own work is that we come from a systems-based approach. And so when we think about inclusivity and we think about access, it's not so much can each individual access our services and use them, but it's more about how do the big systems that are in place in our culture, in our system of higher education, how do they support inclusivity? What can we do within our own way of working that broadens our services and access to our services, not just for the individuals, but for sort of this broader groups. And we're really thinking about issues such as how does a student's culture or their experiences, their social locations, how does that affect their experiences within the university and within the institution? And I was actually in a couple of sessions earlier today where some of these very topics were talked about. So it's really fun to see them brought up again and again. So moving on to sort of the next area, which is that of professional expertise versus lived experience. And what we have found is here in a library, the librarians have a very rich history. And unlike learning developers or learning specialists or whatever you'd like to call us, they have a very specific educational pathway that they go through in order to be a librarian. There is a whole documented history on librarianship and what it is, and there are lots of people thinking about it, and they've been writing about it, not just for maybe 10 or 20 years as we have, but for many, many, many years. And within this system of librarians and librarianship, expertise, professional expertise is highly valued, as it should be. They have spent a long time learning about how to be a librarian, and then that's something that is highly valued. However, and here's where a bit of that intersection comes in, when we're thinking about peer educators, they don't have professional expertise in the way that librarians do, or in the way that professional staff, such as we are, have. What is really important in the peer educator experience, or peer educator milieu, is that they have a lived experience that is highly valued. And it is that which makes them a valuable service provider. And that there are times when students prefer to work with somebody who has that lived experience versus working with somebody who has professional expertise. Certainly there are times when students want that professional expertise. But we, Krista and I have felt that we just come from a system which says, well, of course, peer educators have expertise. Their expertise is in being a student. And that's what makes our programs with peer educators so rich and so vibrant. But yet, there is that tension between them. And so when we've thought about, well, how do we mitigate this tension? What we have sort of realized that we always do is that our role as supervisors becomes very important. And we make very deliberate decisions about when is it important within a particular program or service to have that lived experience, and when is it more important or appropriate to have that professional expertise. And that whenever we are developing something, that's always part of that thinking process that we have. And something else that we really have to emphasize within the librarian community is that programs with peer educators are different from programs with professionals. I think that there's a bit of fear that we have sensed or heard about, that some people feel that, if you have students come in and do a somewhat sort of professional type of program or service, they're going to be a mini librarian. Mm-hmm. They're going to try to do what librarians do, but yet without the background and the knowledge and the skills. And our reaction to that is to say, well, of course not. What students do is different from what professionals do. And so that's something that we have tried to communicate in our work that we do with students. And then the third area is the idea of autonomy versus accountability. And our peer educators, we have so many of them. There are so few of us as supervisors overall. They have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of freedom to do what they want. And because we acknowledge that they are learning within their roles, we also accept failure. And we know that some things are going to fail, but that's part of the learning process. And we have to realize that that happens. But that ability to give students that autonomy and that freedom to fail, though, does sometimes conflict with the idea of accountability. Particularly in our library, we have the notion of excellence in service. And if you're aspiring to excellence in service, that can sometimes conflict directly with let's let people fail, or let's give them the opportunity to fail. We don't want them to, but they might fail. And so for us as supervisors, what we have found is that we have to have ongoing training and we have to have ongoing supervision so that the peer educators themselves, most of whom are very high achievers, realize that they can come to us and say, I think I might fail, or I'm struggling with something, or I need extra help. For them to note when they're at this point where they need extra help, where they can't be autonomous, and then to work with us. And so we constantly try to provide them with that extra support so that while they have freedom to fail, we also want to be highly accountable and we want to offer excellent services and programs for our students. Right now, what we'd like you to do is we're not asking you necessarily to type right now. We just want you to reflect on your own for just a minute or two about your experience with values. We've talked a lot about our values. And we'd like you to think about what are the values in your institution or in your department, whether it's a library, whether it's something akin to student affairs, something else. How do the values that you've identified in your professional work align with those broader organizational values? And how do they intersect? And what's the impact? We're going to pick up on some of these ideas a little bit later in this session. We just want to give you just a minute or two to just jot down on your own or just think internally about these questions. Okay, we're going to move on now.
Okay, so we're moving into looking at the concept of value and how it's really a very tricky one in a lot of ways because there really isn't a universal definition when it comes to education and higher education and how we demonstrate value. It's being informed by a number of different things. So in preparing for this chapter, we went back to the basics and we said, okay, what does the dictionary say about value? Well, it talks about the importance, usefulness, or worth of something. I think that sort of resonates for most of us professionally in terms of wanting to show that our services are useful to students, that they are important, that they are worthy of funding. Now, when you get into the literature, however, beyond the dictionary, and you look up the concept of value, a lot of what comes out is in the business literature. And it's talking about value in a very different way, talking about concepts like return on investment or impact value, the production of a commodity, all these bits that are quite embedded in the jargon of that field, but are not necessarily easy to extrapolate into our own work. So what then do we think about in terms of higher education and what is value in higher education? The one report that we did refer to that was really helpful in doing some of this translating for us was a report on the value of academic libraries by the Association of College Research Libraries, ACRL. It's an American association. And they put this report out where somebody went and dug into the business literature and looked at all the different definitions of value and tried to translate them into a higher education context, and specifically within the libraries. So what can we take from these definitions and what's helpful to us? And so that's all very well and good, but we also need to think about value in terms of our everyday working life. What does it mean for our service to be valuable? What does it mean for our work to be valuable? And how is value played out? What does it look like? And that's a really key piece. And that gets into this whole idea about the demonstration of value and how do we demonstrate value. We have noticed in our experience now being administratively part of our library for coming on 9 years now, that that traditional library services and their methods of demonstrating value and peer educator or peer-based programs and their methods of demonstrating value are quite different. Now, certainly there's going to be some overlap if you think about the information literacy or instructional capacities of librarians and how they might evaluate that. But for a library as a whole, what we've heard a lot around is certainly student contact hours, but also building counts and circulation statistics, right? How often is the collection being used and in what way? Whereas for us, we tend to think more about student satisfaction, evaluative surveys that give us often qualitative feedback, but also impact data related to grade achievement or retention. There's a number of our programs here that link our service delivery and participation and frequency of participation in those services with how students do in terms of their grades. So again, very different ways of demonstrating value. And so there is that different focus, but this was really hit home for us when we joined the library administratively in terms of some reporting that our library needed to do. So our library is part of the Association of Research Libraries here. I believe that's a North American association. And as part of that, they are required to report back a number of statistics related to everything from building facilities to the library's collection, to its instructional services and programming, etc. And so it became very apparent very quickly that it wasn't easy for our services to fit into the rubric, into the template that ARL was providing to our library in order to report back on its activities. And so even in the broader system of libraries in North America, it's less common to have peer-based and academic support services within a library because the type of work that we do and the type of results that we could show, there was really nowhere to put that in the report. So what this really said to us is that we had to figure out a way, at least immediately within our library here, we had to figure out, well, how do we fit in to this context so that they understand the value that we provide, the unique value that we provide to the library, because we're not doing the work of librarians, we're providing something different. And so that really led us to think about how we communicate with our upper administrators and how do we have internal conversations to help get people to understand what it is we do and how we are of value. Okay, so just another quick reflective piece where we'd like you to type into the chat just your responses off the cuff. How do you demonstrate the value of your work? What types of things do you do that shows the effectiveness of what you do? Let's see what we get. It says multiple attendees are typing, so we know it's coming. Okay, so we talk about how hard it is to demonstrate the value of our work. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep, it is very tricky.
Yeah. And Dawn Marsh mentioned that they can't prove a connection to retention and achievement. And I would actually also echo that. So we have some programs which do have access to the data, which allows them to make those links. But we also have many programs which do not have access to that data. And particularly our confidential services, such as our one-on-one appointments, we do not have access to any marks. And so pretty much all we can do are student satisfaction surveys, and just count the number of students who come in.
Yeah. And yet in this sort of day and age of accountability and assessment, at least certainly for us in our higher ed context in Canada, and I know this is the case in other places as well, these are the types of things that we really need to show people. You know, what are students getting out of our services? Why is this worthwhile to do at a university, and how can we demonstrate our effectiveness? So we have Jeff talking about user surveys, faculty feedback, user stats, feedback forms. I think, yeah, all of those are great things. Now, what do you do with all that data? Do you have reports that you send out? Do you link back with the associate academic deans in departments to say, here's how we've served your students? There's any number of mechanisms that are in place. So it's one thing for us to collect information about the value of our work, and it's another to figure out what are the really effective channels for disseminating that information. So that's a little food for thought for you.
I think another thing that this makes me think about, looking at Jeff's comment on faculty feedback, sort of one of the issues that I realize I've always struggled with in that area of demonstrating a value is if I'm a guest lecturer in a class, I honestly feel weird asking the lecturer, the professor, faculty member, to fill out a form on my on what I did in his class, because I feel that would other guest lecturers ask them to do that? I mean, isn't the faculty member demonstrating that they value our work by asking us to be there? And so I think even when we're looking at demonstrating a value, there are some, I think, ethical issues and questions about what really is our role that can be kind of brought into what I think at the surface looks quite simple. But really, the more I think about it, the more confused I get.
Indeed. And there have been a couple of comments that have been posted about how if there are reports, the reports often go up the chain, not necessarily down or laterally, so people might still not know what the impact is. And so I think in terms of, for us as supervisors or managers or working with your director or whomever is in your area, I know I certainly work with my team, and we are looking at data on an ongoing basis and figuring out how it can inform our ongoing work, as well as shaping our programs. So I think it's also a matter of building it into our workflow as an important activity and making sure that it has priority. Okay.
All right. So we wanted to sort of move gently from thinking about how we demonstrate value to some of the broader implications that we're dealing with here. And it's really about, I think, because for us, we moved physically and then we moved administratively. And so both Krista and I are aware of that transformative process that has taken place over the years in terms of how we were changed and our work was changed. But we also have some questions for you about how does the broader department or unit or program or faculty that you're in, how does it transform the work that you do? But then the other side of that too is how do we transform our broader department? I think certainly people who've worked in the library before the Learning Commons was here would say, yes, things have changed. It's really different than it used to be. And so to think about how does our presence influence our broader context as well. And then our second question was, what can we be doing as learning specialists, as learning developers, to promote that greater alignment between what we do and between our institutions. So whether it's within a library setting, or the broader context. And so we wanted to really end this session with just a broader discussion of some of these topics. So we'll be quiet for a few minutes, and well, maybe not a few minutes, we'll be quiet for maybe a minute while we read some of the comments here, and we'd invite you all to put in your own comments as well.
And certainly if you have questions for us on anything that we might have talked about, now would also be a great time that we could address them. So there's some interesting discussion that's happened already a little bit about how difficult it can be to show that services like ours are effective and therefore will be valued. There's some talk about sort of those narrative success stories and how anecdotal information and that sort of thing isn't as valued as hard and fast numbers or data, which is certainly the case.
What we have found, though, I think, which is kind of interesting, is that those anecdotal stories have actually been very useful for our communications and marketing and outreach team here in the library. That when they're putting together sort of their communications or annual reports about the library, our peer educator programs really have a very prominent space in them, because it's not the numbers, but it's the personal stories that I think speak to potential donors and potential sort of library friends. And so while I wouldn't necessarily say that it's directly related to assessment, it is using those anecdotes in very powerful ways.
There's another comment here about needing to put numbers along with it so that people will take it more seriously. And Marianne commented that even with access to student grades, it's difficult to isolate the impact of our services. And I mean, that's the case in educational research overall. We can't imply causation. We're not going to be able to say that as a direct result of attending X, then students developed A, B, and C. We have to paint a broader picture than that. We have to include whatever correlational and quantitative data that we can, along with those contextualizing anecdotal pieces, I think, to paint a picture. Let's see what else is happening here.
Okay. So we've got thank you, Leslie from CIT. I will take a look at that publication. It looks interesting.
Yeah, and certainly, yeah, the anecdotal piece is not always very persuasive when it comes to budget and resources, yes, which is why I think it really behooves us, those of us in this type of profession, to get more comfortable with assessment, to get more comfortable with numbers, not to paint anyone in broad strokes, but by and large, based my experience and talking to other folks, is that doesn't tend to be the area where they have developed strengths, right? Obviously, there's a different background and skill set that's coming into a position like this, but it ends up being really key. So we've got some comments here about sort of the whole package, the integrated service, and how do you measure a service person's friendliness? Absolutely, there are some really intangible pieces. Let's see.
And then I think Sandra here is mentioning some other ways of sort of disseminating it, and I think as a profession, I think perhaps we can do more about really questioning what numbers tell us and what other types of research tell us about what we're doing. So I think when we're thinking about those one-on-one appointments where you're only really having an interaction with one student for an hour, and that can't really be encapsulated in just this little check mark saying, okay, here's one student that I met with. But yet, I think we've all experienced those very rich interactions that we have there, where it's some truly sort of transformational things are happening. But those experiences, I think, could be better reflected in more of this narrative approach or qualitative research than in simply saying, I met with one student for 1 hour.
Yeah. And so again, I think sort of what's coming out is that we really need to be able to look at providing a holistic picture of our services that is informed by those transformative experiences that students have, or what they've gotten out of it that can't necessarily be quantified, but then also pulling what numbers we can, knowing that if that's going to speak in our context, we need to find a way to make that work for us and to find something that we can pull so that we can paint that larger picture. So I can see that there's a conversation happening around assessment, and so expertise in assessment and that sort of thing, which really I'm sure we could all agree would be in another entire session or day talking about that. But before we wrap up, are there any final questions for us? And please feel free to pose us a question, and we could always get back to you by email. Since we're running out of time, we'd be happy to.
I'll also just mention that we do have just a selected bibliography where some of the items that Krista mentioned are, and we also included a few other resources that for us were really important in thinking through these ideas that we've expressed here. So the bibliography will be available, I think, at the end of February, when we are supposed to have access to all of these seminars from this conference.
Yeah. So I guess just to answer a final question from Sandra, what is stronger, grassroots support or evaluation data? In my experience is that it depends on your institution. Different institutions value different kinds of information. So for us here at Guelph, we know that we do need the numbers to present. We do need some quantitative information, but that our administration is also very focused on the student experience. And so painting a picture of what students have to say and how they engaged with our services is helpful here. I've worked with people at other institutions that say, our administration does not care about any of that fluffy stuff. They just want the numbers. So I think it's a matter of sort of honing in on what your institutional culture is all about and what will speak there.
Yeah.